Imagine you're looking at an economy where millions of people are, technically employed. They're working from sunrise to sunset. But the sheer economic value of their daily labor it produces barely enough to survive.
Right. It's like the engine is running constantly, but the car is just idling in the driveway.
Exactly. You have this massive population engaged in constant motion, but the overall engine is just idling. Now, imagine someone looking at that exact same economy and promising to multiply its wealth by 5, taking it to a staggering $1 trillion.
Which is just a massive number.
It's unimaginably ambitious, and doing it by entirely replacing the traditional plow and the smoky factory with a swarm of AI robots and quantum algorithms.
Yeah, that's the real leap here.
Right. So today, for our deep dive, we are opening up a fascinating set of economic blueprints. These are dated May 2026, and they are focused entirely on West Bengal, India.
And, geographically speaking, it's a critical spot.
Oh, absolutely. We are looking at a state sitting right at a geographical and economic crossroads in South Asia. It has this remarkably rich cultural history, incredibly fertile delta lands, and highly strategic ports looking right out at the Bay of Bengal.
And right now, as of these documents, it sits as India's 6th largest state economy.
Right. But the question on the table today, for you listening and for us, is about this massively ambitious future detailed in these sources. We're talking about proposals that want to take a roughly $210 to $230 billion economy and just vault it into the trillion-dollar stratosphere.
The contrast in these documents is really striking. I mean, on one hand, you have the baseline reality of a state with deeply entrenched structural bottlenecks.
Yeah, the starting line isn't exactly easy.
No, not at all. And then on the other hand, you have two completely divergent blueprints for escape. One blueprint outlines this grueling, highly pragmatic 15 to 20-year climb.
The grinded-out approach.
Exactly. And the other proposes a radical 10-year technological moonshot demanding quite literally 20% annual growth.
Which is wild. But to evaluate either of those paths, I feel like we have to start by dissecting the actual mechanics of what's happening right now.
Right. We need the anatomy of the baseline. So looking at mid-2026, the nominal gross state domestic product, the GSDP, is hovering around 20.3 lakh crore.
Which translates to that $210 to $230 billion mark we mentioned.
Exactly. And the real growth rate is actually solid. State documents peg it around 7.6% recently, mostly operating within a bandwidth of 6.8 to 8.6%.
Okay, so a $230 billion economy growing at 7.6%? I mean, that sounds fundamentally healthy on paper, right?
On the surface, yes. But peeling back the layers reveals a pretty stark paradox regarding individual wealth.
Yeah, the per capita numbers are where it gets rough. It's the 6th largest state economy by sheer mass, but the per capita GSDP, the actual economic output divided by the population, is only about $1,800 to $2,000.
Which is quite low.
Right. It ranks West Bengal somewhere around 21st among Indian states, so it sits below the national average. You have this massive collective engine generating hundreds of billions, but the individual dividends are fractured. They're comparatively small.
And that fractured dividend comes directly from the sectoral composition of the economy. The sources provide a really specific breakdown of this.
What's the split look like?
So services dominate. They make up roughly 53 to 55% of the economic output.
Okay.
Industry contributes about 24 to 30%, and agriculture makes up the remaining 17 to 21%.
Got it. And within agriculture, I mean, the sources make it clear West Bengal is undeniably a powerhouse.
Oh, absolutely. Largest producer of rice in the entire country. Leads in potatoes, fish, jute, and tea.
Right. And if you look at the headline labor data from late 2025, the unemployment rate is reported at an impressively low 3.6%.
Yeah, about that 3.6%.
Wait, I have to jump in here because I was looking at that figure and genuinely struggling to reconcile it with the absolute panic over urban job creation found elsewhere in the exact same blueprint.
It seems like a contradiction, right?
Totally. Something in the math just isn't adding up. If the state is functionally at full employment, I mean, 3.6% is great. Why would youth job creation be listed as a critical systemic vulnerability?
Well, if it's
it feels like a classic case of disguised unemployment. It's like a restaurant where the dining room is absolutely packed. There isn't a single open table. So that represents the low unemployment rate.
Okay, I like this analogy.
But you look closer and you realize everyone is just ordering tap water and sharing a single appetizer. They are technically, dining, but the revenue being generated per table is dangerously low.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. The revenue per table is low because the agricultural sector is absorbing a vastly disproportionate share of the workforce.
Right. So they're employed, but barely making anything.
Exactly. I mean, agriculture contributes roughly a fifth of the total GSDP, but it employs far more than a fifth of the population. You have millions of people working the land. But because a single acre can only yield so much physical product, their actual economic output, their labor productivity, hits a really hard ceiling.
So there are just too many people on the same plot of land.
Precisely. If you were to mathematically remove a significant portion of those workers from the fields, the overall agricultural output of the state wouldn't necessarily drop. There are simply too many hands doing low-value work.
Ah, so they are employed on paper, which gives us that nice 3.6% figure, but they are underutilized in reality.
Right, and that creates a cascading effect. Because the rural jobs are low yield and offer basically no upward mobility, you naturally see migration toward urban centers like Kolkata.
Because they're chasing the high-value jobs in that 55% services sector.
Yes, but here's the catch. An IT firm or a corporate finance hub doesn't absorb unskilled or semi-skilled labor by the millions.
No, of course not. You can't just take a farmer and put them in a software firm the next day.
Exactly. And hanging over all of this maneuverability is the state's debt. The sources note a debt-to-GSDP ratio of around 38%.
I want to dig into that, actually, because I want you to help me understand the actual friction that 38% creates for a state government trying to grow. Is 38% really that bad?
Well, think about the mechanics of state revenue. When a state has a 38% debt-to-GSDP ratio, a massive chunk of every tax rupee collected goes immediately towards servicing the interest on that historical debt.
So it doesn't even pay down the principal.
No, it just pays the carrying cost. So that leaves a severely diminished pool of capital for discretionary spending. In macroeconomics, if you really want to simulate structural growth, you need capital expenditure.
Meaning you need to build things.
Right, you need to build new roads, deep-sea ports, power grids, industrial parks. A high debt burden structurally starves your capital expenditure budget. You end up paying for the past instead of investing in the future.
That makes a lot of sense. And the sources actually use a really specific term to diagnose the root of this structural bottleneck. They call it premature tertiarization.
Which is a bit of a mouthful.
It is. But anyone following development economics knows this is the classic trap of bypassing the factory floor.
Yeah, the traditional historical path of economic development is highly linear.
Right. You start agrarian, you figure out how to farm more efficiently, which frees up labor. Then that labor moves into mass manufacturing and heavy industry.
And that industrial phase is what builds a middle class, upgrades the skill base of the population, and accumulates capital.
And only after all that does the economy mature into a services-led model.
But West Bengal essentially skipped that middle step. The blueprints detail this severe deindustrialization phase. We're talking about legacy sectors, the massive jute mills, the traditional tea estates coming under incredible strain over the decades.
Yeah, the text impartially notes that periods of historical policy uncertainty created an environment where large-scale private capital became, well, highly risk-averse.
Investment was inconsistent, companies relocated, so the state transitioned from a heavily agrarian base directly into a services economy, relying on IT, tourism, finance, without ever fully realizing a matured, high-employment industrial phase.
It's the equivalent of building a skyscraper and skipping the middle floors entirely.
Oh, another analogy. Go ahead.
Yeah, think about it. You have this massive, sprawling foundation on the ground level, which is agriculture. Millions of people are down there working the soil. And way up at the top, you have this shiny penthouse suite, which is the services sector, the IT parks, the corporate finance hubs.
But the middle floors are empty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The traditional manufacturing and heavy industry floors are mostly just empty space. So the structural problem isn't just that the building is top-heavy. The real crisis is that there are no stairs.
Right.
How do the people on the ground floor ever climb to the penthouse if there is no manufacturing sector to transition them out of the fields, teach them formal industrial skills, and integrate them into the modern economy?
They don't. They remain trapped on the ground floor. Which brings us right back to your restaurant analogy of disguised unemployment. Services like IT generate tremendous GSDP, which makes the top-line economic numbers look robust. But they are incredibly capital-intensive and skill-intensive.
Right, they aren't labor-intensive.
Exactly. A software development park cannot employ 50,000 displaced farmers. But a steel plant, an automobile assembly line, a massive leather processing facility.
Those are the middle floors.
Those are the middle floors. They absorb low-yield agricultural labor, provide formal employment, and build a robust tax-paying middle class.
Okay.
Skipping that phase leaves a society with really profound income inequality.
And the geographical irony here is just hard to ignore when you read through the geographic data in the sources. You look at the map, and West Bengal has the ports in Kolkata and Haldia. It has the riverine access. It honestly should be the undisputed industrial gateway connecting India to Southeast Asia.
It has the natural positioning for it.
But the text explicitly points out that West Bengal has steadily lost its share of national GDP to southern and western Indian states. States like Gujarat and Tamil Nadu are specifically highlighted as having captured the manufacturing momentum.
Because those states relentlessly built their middle floors. Gujarat poured capital into industrial infrastructure, port connectivity, and power grids. Tamil Nadu focused on manufacturing depth, auto components, technical skilling.
So they created the physical and policy infrastructure to absorb all that mass labor into industry.
Exactly. They capitalized on the manufacturing momentum that West Bengal, which was hampered by those historical policy uncertainties and infrastructural bottlenecks, was unable to capture.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the first of our two blueprints. Because if the problem is the missing middle, the pragmatic solution is to retroactively build it.
Right, the 15 to 20-year roadmap.
Yes, the sources present this very detailed, highly structured roadmap to drag this $230 billion economy up to $1 trillion, and the math required to do that is just unforgiving. To hit $1 trillion by 2040 or 2045, the state has to multiply its economy by 4 or 5 times.
Which means a sustained 12 to 15% nominal growth rate every single year for up to 2 decades.
Which is wild.
It is a colossal generational undertaking. And this pragmatic roadmap is broken down into 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 is the foundation phase. This is projected to cover years 1 through 5.
Okay, so what's the goal for the first 5 years?
The economic target here is to push the GSDP to the $400 to $500 billion mark. And the focus is entirely on structural reform. It targets decisive land acquisition reforms, labor flexibility, establishing genuine single-window clearances for businesses.
And they want a specific $50 to $100 billion in actual foreign direct investment realization, right?
Yes, that's the metric for success in Phase 1.
You know, reading this, it really reads like the eat your vegetables phase of economic development.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
There is no flashy technology here. It's just fundamental governance. But I want to dig into how this actually works, because the hardest part of Phase 1 isn't the physical infrastructure.
Oh, definitely not.
Like, they mentioned fast-tracking deep-sea ports like Tajpur or Sagar and completing the Varanasi-Kolkata expressways. But pouring concrete is relatively easy if you have the money.
If you have the capital, yes.
Right. The real friction is the soft infrastructure. Like, how do you execute land acquisition reforms in a state historically plagued by intense, sometimes volatile land disputes?
Well, the sources make it clear that soft infrastructure is the absolute bedrock of investor confidence. They point out that to achieve these massive growth numbers, the state requires a gross capital formation, an investment rate of 35 to 40% of its GSDP.
Meaning nearly 40% of everything the economy produces in a given year has to be reinvested directly back into capital assets, like factories, machines, roads.
Correct. And given the 38% debt burden we discussed earlier, the state government mathematically cannot fund that level of capital formation itself.
So they need private money.
The vast majority of that capital must come from private domestic and foreign investors. And private capital is entirely risk-averse regarding soft infrastructure.
Right. If a global manufacturer wants to build a mega factory, they need absolute certainty that the land acquisition is legally pristine.
They cannot risk years of litigation or social unrest. And that single window clearance they mentioned, that means dismantling the bureaucracy where a company has to get 50 different permits from 50 different departments.
Because each department is a potential choke point for corruption or delay.
Exactly. So Phase 1 is really about rewriting the governance code to prove to global capital that the environment is predictable.
Okay, so let's assume they ate their vegetables. Once that trust is established, the blueprint moves to Phase 2, which is acceleration. This covers years 6 through 10, and it targets a $700 to $800 billion economy.
And here is where those missing middle floors finally get constructed. The plan shifts to heavy industry-led growth.
Right, they talk about reviving legacy strength, like the steel and petrochemical hubs in Haldia. but then simultaneously bolting on modern manufacturing engines like electronics assembly, auto components, and semiconductors.
It also involves a massive structural shift in how agriculture is monetized.
How so?
The goal is to transform basic agriculture into high-value agribusiness. Instead of merely growing the potato and selling it raw, the state needs to build agro-processing hubs. You process it, freeze it, package it, and export it.
Which means building a comprehensive statewide cold chain infrastructure, right? To prevent spoilage and actually capture the value add locally.
Exactly. Stop selling raw materials and start selling finished goods.
Makes sense? And then we hit phase 3, sustainability, years 11 and beyond. This is where they finally cross that $1 trillion threshold.
Right. This is the transition into innovation hubs, high-value advanced manufacturing, green energy adoption.
And implementing climate resilience, which the sources note is absolutely vital for a highly vulnerable delta region facing rising sea levels.
It's a very comprehensive linear plan.
It is. When I first read this 3-phase plan, my immediate reaction was, this makes perfect logical sense. It mirrors the exact developmental path of Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and even early industrial China.
It's the proven playbook.
And here's my issue. Looking at the timeline, I seriously question if this is a trap.
A trap. A trap based on the assumption that the global economy will just wait for them.
Exactly that. 15 to 20 years is a lifetime in global macroeconomics. By the time West Bengal spends a decade grinding out land reforms and building traditional steel plants and auto component factories in phase 2, won't the rest of the global supply chain have completely evolved?
That is the big risk.
Are they just signing up to spend 20 years frantically trying to become what other states already were a decade ago?
And that is the fundamental vulnerability of the pragmatic model. It relies on a completely static view of global demand. If you spend 10 years building a traditional automotive supply chain and the world moves entirely to autonomous EV micromanufacturing,
your newly built middle floors are instantly obsolete.
exactly. You have successfully solved yesterday's problem tomorrow.
And that impatience, that real fear of structural obsolescence, is the perfect primer for the second major blueprint provided in our sources.
Yes, the moonshot.
This is where the deep dive gets genuinely wild, because this counterproposal abandons the 15 to 20-year timeline entirely. It demands 20% annual growth, and it wants to compress the entire trillion-dollar journey into a single decade.
That's a staggering acceleration.
It doesn't want to catch up by building traditional factories at all. It wants to completely leapfrog the industrial phase using exponential technologies.
And the architecture of a leapfrog strategy is fascinating because it doesn't discard the baseline. It hacks it. The blueprint doesn't start by ignoring the millions of people in agriculture. Instead, it proposes applying cutting-edge technology to the oldest, most foundational sectors, agriculture and textiles.
Okay, let's unpack the agriculture proposal, because the sheer scale of the logistics here is incredible. The text outlines this concept called the Pan-Himalayan Refrigerated Rail Corridor.
Which sounds like a sci-fi novel.
It really does. The vision is to establish high-speed, fully refrigerated freight trains originating in Nepal, moving down through the agricultural belts of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, slicing straight through West Bengal to the port of Kolkata.
And then shipping outward to high-margin markets like Dubai, Singapore, and East Asia.
Right.
No.
But to understand why this is a 20% growth idea, we have to look at the physics and economics of perishables. Because, like we established, West Bengal produces bumper crops, massive surpluses of rice variants, mangoes, floriculture.
But traditional sea freight takes weeks, and ambient temperature rail leads to massive spoilage.
Yeah.
Without an integrated cold chain, a farmer holding perishable goods is basically operating under a ticking clock. And this leads to an economic phenomenon called a distress sale.
Right, because the mangoes are going to rot in 3 days, so the farmer has absolutely no leverage. They have to sell to the middleman for pennies on the dollar just to recoup something.
Precisely. The value is destroyed before it ever leaves the state. But the Pan-Himalayan refrigerated rail line changes the physics of the trade.
How so?
Well, if you can move fresh produce across the subcontinent and load it onto ships in a matter of days, you are no longer selling a bulk commodity. You are selling premium freshness to global markets.
Wow, okay.
And the blueprint layers this rail network with decentralized solar-powered cold storage at the individual farm level.
So they can keep it fresh before it even hits the train.
Right. And then it uses AI-optimized routing to predict regional crop volumes and match them instantly with global market demand. It takes a fragmented, low-yield agrarian base and turns it into a highly integrated, high-margin export engine.
That is incredible. And they apply that exact same leapfrog logic to the textile industry, too, because West Bengal has this world-renowned historical textile heritage, the fine muslin, the Jamdani weaves.
Beautiful, historically significant work.
Yeah. And the pragmatic approach would be to build massive, smoky 20th century textile mills to just compete on sheer volume.
Yeah.
But the leapfrog blueprint proposes a textile renaissance powered by what they call robotic microfactories.
It's a complete shift from low-cost mass production to high-value, tech-enabled bespoke production. The proposal involves integrating smart fibers, nanotechnology fabrics, and wearable tech into the traditional weaves.
So instead of relying on a massive, slow-moving cargo ship of a mega factory, we're talking about deploying a fleet of highly agile precision speedboats.
Another great analogy, yes.
These robotic microfactories can be distributed across the entire state. They produce highly customized, tech-infused textiles entirely on demand.
So if an order comes in from Milan or Tokyo, the microfactory produces it instantly. It virtually eliminates inventory risk and material waste.
But let's test the market reality here for a second. A robotic microfactory producing nanotech muslin sounds amazing on paper. But are global consumers actually going to pay the necessary premium for design tech fusion textiles coming out of Bengal? Like, does a market exist that is large enough to move the needle on a statewide 20% growth target?
It's a fair question. The blueprint's gamble is based on rapidly shifting global consumer trends. The luxury and high-end apparel markets are moving aggressively towards sustainability, zero waste, and bespoke customization.
That's true. Fast fashion is getting a lot of pushback.
Massive regulatory and consumer backlash due to its carbon footprint and waste. So if a robotic microfactory in Kolkata can produce a batch of high-tech, sustainable garments strictly to order, doing it faster and with a lower carbon footprint than a traditional mega factory, the global premium market will respond.
Okay, I see the vision. But the entire premise rests on the assumption that the state can actually master the underlying technology.
And that is the heaviest lift of all.
Right, which brings us to the most critical hurdle in the entire document. If AI is routing the refrigerated trains and robots are weaving the smart textiles, who is building and programming the robots?
You can't outsource that if you want 20% growth.
Exactly. To sustain a 20% growth rate, West Bengal cannot afford to just import this technology and be a passive consumer. It has to become the primary generator of deep tech.
And the sources address this requirement by proposing next-generation special economic zones. They call them tech SEZs, but they explicitly differentiate these from traditional IT outsourcing parks.
Oh yeah, they are looking way beyond basic software support. The blueprint proposes establishing an AI and autonomous systems, SEZ, a quantum and photonics valley, and a biotech and health tech hub.
They essentially want to create a national robotics zone.
And the specific metric that really jumped out at me is their goal to train 1 million robotic technicians over 10 years. They use the phrase human-AI collaborative factories.
Which is key. The stated goal isn't to use robots to replace humans for cheaper labor.
Right.
The goal is to have humans overseeing the AI, doing the creative problem-solving and systems management, while the robots handle the repetitive heavy lifting.
That is the absolute crux of leapfrogging, isn't it?
Yes. You don't try to compete with other developing nations on the cost of cheap manual labor. It's a race to the bottom. Instead, you compete on human-AI synergy. You build environments where a worker's output is exponentially multiplied because they are managing a swarm of automated machines rather than turning a single wrench.
I understand the theory, I really do. But I have to play the skeptic here regarding the actual execution. We started this deep dive analyzing a state where millions of people are essentially engaged in subsistence agriculture.
Right.
Now we're talking about training 1 million robotic technicians in a decade. I mean, that is an educational and cultural quantum leap. How do you take a workforce whose families have farmed jute for generations or operated basic hand looms and suddenly transition them into a quantum valley managing photonics fabrication?
It is arguably the steepest human capital challenge imaginable. However, the blueprints point to a very specific, historically grounded advantage that West Bengal actually possesses right now. Its legacy research institutions. We are talking about globally recognized centers of excellence like IIT Kharagpur, Jadavpur University, the Indian Statistical Institute. The fundamental intellectual bedrock for advanced mathematics, statistics, and engineering has been sitting there for decades.
So the brains are already there.
Exactly. The historical failure hasn't been a lack of intelligence. It has been the lack of a bridge between academic innovation and commercial industrialization.
So the design of these new SEZs is meant to physically and economically act as that bridge. You create policy incentives to locate global AI and robotics firms right next to these historic universities, creating an immediate, frictionless talent pipeline from the classroom to the laboratory to the factory floor.
That's the plan. You aren't building the capacity for deep tech from scratch. You are redirecting an existing academic powerhouse toward applied commercial technology and then scaling it massively through vocational robotics training programs.
Okay, but to get those global AI firms to set up shop in West Bengal in the first place, you need a governance environment that operates at the speed of tech.
And this leads to what might be the most quietly revolutionary proposal in the entire 10-year blueprint.
The AI-driven governance. This part of the blueprint is fascinating. They propose making West Bengal the first Indian state to fully integrate AI into the core of public administration. We are talking about intelligent permitting, predictive infrastructure planning, meaning the AI analyzes data to anticipate exactly where power and water capacity will be needed before a bottleneck ever occurs, and citizen-centric chatbot platforms handling everything from land records to construction clearances.
And this directly attacks the soft infrastructure problem we discussed in phase 1 of the pragmatic plan.
The bureaucracy.
Right. Bureaucracy, opaque regulations, and the resulting risk of corruption have historically stifled capital inflow. But if you implement explainable AI to handle permits, you remove the human choke points.
Explainable AI being systems where you can actually see how it made its decision, right?
Exactly, no black boxes. So when a global investor submits a proposal for a microfactory, the algorithm cross-references zoning laws, environmental regulations, and grid capacity instantly. Setup times shrink from 18 months to 3 days.
The mechanics of that are brilliant. Because if the administrative rules are literally written in code, you can't bribe an algorithm to look the other way, and an algorithm doesn't hold up a permit for political leverage. It creates absolute transparency.
And for a global corporation, that kind of predictability and speed is often far more valuable than a straight tax break.
So let's assume this all works. The AI governance brings in the capital, the SEZs train the workforce, and the robotic microfactories start churning out high-value goods. How do you physically connect this new, hyper-advanced internal economy to the rest of the world?
That requires the physical connectors, specifically the logistics and port expansion outlined in the text. The blueprint calls for massively upgrading the existing Kolkata and Haldia ports. They are targeting smart port automation to speed up turnaround times and installing LNG bunkering facilities.
Right. LNG bunkering being the infrastructure to provide cleaner, liquefied natural gas fuel to modern, environmentally compliant cargo ships.
Yes, which makes the ports globally competitive. Furthermore, the plan looks inland. It proposes integrating the massive inland waterways, specifically the Ganges-Brahmaputra network.
Which is a huge natural resource.
Huge. And the economic strategy here is to turn West Bengal into a true land bridge. Instead of relying solely on ocean freight, you use advanced riverine transport to connect South Asia directly with the ASEAN and BIMSTEC nations.
Okay, BIMSTEC being the Bay of Bengal initiative for multi-sectoral technical and economic cooperation, right? Which includes countries like Thailand and Myanmar.
Exactly. You essentially bypass traditional maritime choke points by utilizing rivers and advanced rail to reach those eastern markets directly.
And while the automated ports and river barges are moving physical goods out to the world, the blueprint also has a strategy for bringing people and global mindshare into the state. They call it tech-infused tourism.
It's an interesting pivot.
I found this angle incredibly clever, because they want to take Kolkata's deep intellectual and architectural heritage, combine it with the natural beauty of places like the Darjeeling Hills, and overlay the entire experience with advanced technology. We're looking at AR and VR heritage trails, robotics and art festivals, and dedicated, hyper-connected digital nomad hubs.
It's an economic strategy masquerading as a tourism campaign. It fundamentally alters the global perception of the state.
It totally rebrands the entire geography.
Yeah.
You aren't just visiting a quaint historical tea garden that feels like a relic of the 19th century. You are visiting an augmented reality enhanced historical tea garden that is entirely powered by a localized green energy microgrid.
It's a completely different vibe.
It actively rewrites the global narrative of West Bengal from a developing region struggling with agriculture to a cutting-edge, sustainable tech destination.
And there is always a bit, but all of this vision, the solar microgrids, the automated ports, the quantum valleys, the refrigerated rail corridors, it all requires an oceanic amount of capital upfront.
Oh, yeah, none of this is cheap.
And if we look at the mechanics of modern finance, traditional venture capital or commercial banking is often structurally incapable of funding this specific kind of transformation.
Which is the final crucial puzzle piece in the sources, the Bengal Innovation Bank, or Growth Bank. The blueprints describe it as a state-backed, market-oriented institution designed to provide something called patient capital. I really want to break down why regular banks can't do this.
Well, it comes down to the mathematics of risk and time horizons. Traditional venture capital funds operate on relatively short cycles, right? They want an exit strategy and a massive return in 5 to 7 years.
Right, they want to flip it.
Exactly. And commercial banks require immediate, low-risk interest payments on their loans. But building a deep-tech robotics cluster or laying down a cross-continental refrigerated rail line involves massive upfront capital expenditure that might not show a profitable return for a decade.
So a commercial bank mathematically cannot absorb that decade of zero returns due to their own interest rate pressures. So the state steps in. A state-backed growth bank can issue specialized financial instruments, things like green bonds for the solar storage or logistics bonds for the rail lines to underwrite these SEZ entrepreneurs.
They provide the capital necessary to build the infrastructure without demanding those immediate, punishing financial returns that would bankrupt a nascent tech ecosystem.
So it's called patient capital because the bank is literally willing to be patient.
Exactly. It acts as the financial shock absorber. By providing patient capital, the state ensures that the wealth generated by this technological transition remains within the local ecosystem, reinvesting into the next generation of infrastructure rather than immediately being extracted to satisfy global commercial debt.
Wow. This has been an immense amount of ground to cover. Let's take a breath and synthesize this monumental journey because it's a lot for you listening to take in. We started by looking at the hard data of West Bengal as it stands today, a $210 to $230 billion economy.
We saw the undeniable agricultural strengths, but we also exposed the structural bottlenecks, the disguised unemployment, the premature tertiarization, and the glaring absence of those middle industrial floors between the farm and the IT office.
And then we examine the pragmatic 20-year path, a rigorous, grueling process of grinding out foundational land and labor reforms, building traditional heavy industry, capturing foreign direct investment, and slowly multiplying the economy through proven historical methods.
That's eating the vegetables.
Right. And then we plunged into the visionary 10-year moonshot, the audacious 20% growth plan to leapfrog the industrial age entirely. Implementing AI-driven public governance, building quantum SEZs, deploying robotic microfactories for textiles, and running refrigerated rail corridors straight through the Himalayas.
Two profoundly different blueprints, addressing the exact same geography, the exact same structural debt, and the exact same human potential.
Reviewing both paths leaves me with a final, really lingering thought. For the last century, the history of modern economic development has followed a strict set of rules. Regions have always had to walk before they can run.
Right, the linear path.
A society moves from subsistence agriculture to grueling low-wage manufacturing, and only after decades of capital accumulation, it finally ascends to high-tech, high-value services. But if a state can truly utilize AI, advanced robotics, and algorithmic governance to completely bypass that brutal sweatshop phase of industrialization, what does that actually mean for the rest of the developing world?
It changes everything.
Are we about to see the old, established rules of global economic development rewritten entirely from the shores of the Bay of Bengal?
If they can execute the leapfrog, it ceases to be a regional blueprint. It becomes a global template.
It really is the defining economic question of the next 2 decades. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the blueprints of the future, look closer at the numbers, and we'll see you next time.